Hello and welcome everyone to this event organized by Soul Collective Arts and Cultural Center. Soul Collective is an arts and cultural center based in Sacramento, California. We focus on art, culture, wellness, and activism. And this series, this project is called Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx Mexican. And this project is made of a virtual exhibition accompanied with artist talks and a panel discussion that are happening during the month of February and the first week of March. And this project was in part funded by the GenteChicana SOYmos Chicanos Art Fund and the Greater Milwaukee Foundation. And tonight we are gonna welcome a great friend and guest that has been with us before, talking about the outdoors. But tonight, Jose is going to be talking a little bit more about his artistic side. José González is the founder and director emeritus of Latino Outdoors. He is a professional educator with training in the fields of education and conservation while engaging in different artistic endeavors with art and messaging, often exploring the intersections of environment and culture. As a partner in the Abarna Group and through his own consulting, his work focuses on equity and inclusion, frameworks, and practices in the environmental, outdoor, and conservation fields. He is also an illustrator and science communicator. And tonight, I'd like to welcome José González for this talk that he's going to present for this project. Welcome every one of you for this presentation. And Jose, pass the mic to you. Thank you.
Órale, gracias, Luis. Thank you so much. Hope everybody can hear me okay. If not, let us know. Gracias, Luis, for helping kind of manage the space y todo esto. And then I'll predominantly speak in English, pero you'll hear that pero like type of Spanglish code switching. So if you if I say something that you don't catch and it's crucial to your understanding, just let us know so I can make sure. Sometimes it's a word, expression, or phrase and whatnot. What I'm excited is we have this time here that I really want to invite all of you to ask questions and participate, because we're with like a group of 100, 200 people, and not all the questions get answered. Or you often think it's like, oh, I'm not going to ask my question because maybe it's not as important as somebody else's, or maybe everybody already knows this and I'm the only one that doesn't know that. Ask it, because it's going to be the neat thing. I see Monica and Jaren are here, so I'm already expecting and hoping for a question from them as well as examples. And I share this because a lot of the current work that I do is oriented around outdoor equity, access, parks conservation, like public lands, a lot some policy work, workshops, equity and inclusion design, like you name it. And yet there's been a strand of my quote unquote arte, my art, that has been pretty core to who I've been ever since I, as an immigrant kid, arrived to the United States. And it has a lot of threads of influence, of things that some people are familiar, some are not, that sometimes is visible, sometimes it's not. There's periods in which I share it quite often, others are not. So this is that focused opportunity. So I'm going to share a couple of slides that speak to examples of process, influences, the way that I think about it, style, and all of that. And then we want to open it up to questions. So there's a lot that I could share, but I know that I won't share as much as I think could speak to. So I'll start with that. And let's make sure this is ready. Perfect. And I know maybe not everyone will have the option to see what I'm sharing. So if that's the case, let us know something specific. I'll try to be descriptive with it as well. And then also, when we get to the Q&A, if you have the opportunity to show your video, to ask your question, please do. It'll just help to make sure we capture it. But of course, I want to understand and respect that everybody's, you're zooming in with from very different spaces and needs. So I want to start with this one because I think this one is Xochitl, because I think it can be a good starting point as to how it captures some intersecting influences. First and foremost, this is a watercolor, and it's a watercolor done with Crayola watercolors. And the reason why is because they're accessible, but also they provided the vibrancy in colors that I was looking, that I was not getting through other things like Prismacolors or other types of brands that I know are really good and they're fantastic for a lot of artists use for when they want to get very technical and specific. But what I was going for after testing a lot of them, I was like, Crayolas are it. And so there's that connection to, I don't know, Luis, maybe rascuache is not the right or appropriate term, but growing up as, in a low socioeconomic, poor immigrant background, I think it resonated with like, what's going to be most accessible is going to be more useful, because that's what's available. This is just like, as a kid with my brothers, saving up to buy a Nintendo at the flea market. Like that was it, as an example of making do. So that's in terms of the tools. In terms of the visuals and the aesthetics, you both see it's not as cartoony, but it's definitely illustration based, right? It's the kind of thing that you could probably see it maybe in some type of children's book. It has that aspect, but you see the Mesoamerican kind of codis motif. You see a little bit of the 1960s Chicano screen print movement motif. That's all part of it. Xochitl is one of the Mexica deities, specifically for women. And so that really spoke to a lot of the awakening and connecting and learning that I had in college in terms of finding and in some ways reconnecting to my identity. So when I see Chicano and Mexican, like that speaks to me, that is me. So these are little ways in which a lot of the things that I create have a deeper story and intention. Yes, it's because they're things that I like. Yes, because it's the thing that I like to doodle and kind of create, but I have layers to these in the way that they are created. And the next one. And speaking, on that kind of cartoony illustration front, I've always been attracted to like children's book illustrations. And so they've influenced a lot of how I sometimes approach or think about the work. So this is one of those examples, right? Both kind of the alphabet series kind of element of ABC, while also the illustration is very children oriented. This is an example of that. And so I created these, actually, they were kind of for, they were the names of kids, for example, that started with the letter A. So these are examples of those. And it shows a little bit of the process of kind of approaching a black and white to a color. Also, as I'm going through these, if there's chats, if there's questions you want to drop in the chat, please do, or any comments or observations, and then I'll trust Luis to capture those. And so what that looks like for these watercolor pieces is something like this. It is, you have your piece of watercolor paper. I will have drawn directly on it. I will have inked it with I'm just blanked on the name of the tool, but they're all ink pens. I generally don't use ink brushes for these. Part of that is just because for what I need to create doesn't require that either that type of technical expertise or finesse. And then also is just both my preference in terms of growing up with ink pens. And then I'll just paint directly on it. Sometimes I will, if I really cared about preserving the original kind of pen and pencil, or maybe the original ink, I will make copies of them and then paint the copy, but it'll depend on the process. Ideally, this is kind of like what the setup will look like, as an example for some of these watercolor pieces. And then another component is screen printing. And so screen printing or silk screen is for me was an introduction in college, and it was same thing through the Chicano studies classes. I had the opportunity and benefit of taking one of the classes from Malaquias Montoya's, master screen printer, Chicano artist, 1960s on to now, professor, teacher, you know, like you name it. His name, I think, in this space is one that's known and respected. And I had the opportunity to kind of, you know, take his class and learn from him. And that provided that initial spark between undergraduate and graduate school that I could create some of these pieces. And so this one is titled Siembra, and this was produced in graduate school as part of an independent course study that I designed with the professor, because I wanted to take the elements of environmental justice and like environmental awareness and action with my ethnic cultural identity, and what could that look like. And so why here you see this story, right, of sembrando, of seeding the seeds and thinking about regenerative cycles, and Mother Earth, of course, is like that message is there, but the style, the aesthetic is definitely, even the profile, of course, you see of the woman's face here is grounded in that Chicano aesthetic. And that was born out of undergrad because I would, you know, I would be in the campus club for MECHA, Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano Chicano de Aztlán, where we would be thinking about the social justice issues, the work, community-oriented building and education and so forth. And then I would go to my CalPERG campus clubs, where we had a lot of environmental oriented work. And I would always be asking the questions in both of these. And one, you know, in MECHA is like, hey, could we do more environmental related work? What about environmental justice? And in CalPERG, I'd be like, hey, can we talk about how this is connected to the social impact and excluded communities and so forth? And that's why my machista friends in college gave me that moniker, or I guess a nom de plume that I sometimes use, Green Chicano. Like that was a gift from them. And so this is an example, right, of what that connection of work and identities looks like. And moving to kind of contemporary, I'm a very analog person. I'd love to be able to like paint directly on the paper or run the print. But I started experimenting with digital by looking at, you know, photos of either peers and colleagues and friends, and working with this question of what does it mean to be a future ancestor, and also what could be a contemporary CODIS. So, so with that, then be able to say, suppose that as we, especially, you know, all of us that identify in that spectrum of you know, being Chicano, Chicanx, and everything from there related to that, what could it look like for us as we are continuing to work to have this to be rooted in our identity, moving forward in time, knowing it's not the 1960s, right? Like, so we're connected to that movement, but what does that movement look like now? What would that movement look like 20, 30, 50 years from now? And so I thought it's like, how do we move rooted with the past, but really making sure that we're still oriented by the future? And so I thought about how we would carry this ancestral energy, how would like this energy, we would have it as armor, as, you know, as parts of us being living codices in that way. And so a lot of these photos connect that in that way. And so that was both for at large aspects of cultural identity, but also just kind of cultural relationships and behaviors. And so this one, you know, you can see that it's similar but very different than this one, community organizers over here, whereas this one is un baile, it's a dance. And so it's like, what does that mean to ensure that we would continue to carry forth healthy cultural actions and reference points, knowing that there's also a lot of unhealthy ones that we inherited that we gotta let go. So like toxic masculinity in the form of machismo is one perfect example of that. And so that's all part of the stories that I would be capturing with this kind of contemporary codices work that's also digital. No, say this with some humor, right? No artist probably ever gets away from the gonna do some self-portraits series in some way or another. I always avoided them because it's just hard, right? It's like drawing yourself, just drawing people, whether it's in caricature or portrait form, is a challenge. You're trying to capture likeness. And yet at the same time, as an artist, like you're the most familiar with yourself. So if you really don't know how to capture, understand your features, then that's where you start. You're your first own model. But I share these because it was like, as I started to think about portraiture, it was trying to capture these elements of humor, of self-identity, of what did it mean. A lot of them started with this duality, right? Of like, I'm this and this. Part of that stems from that very Chicano, Chicanx, Latinx, Mexican really identity of ni de aquí ni de allá. So I'm always like trying to figure out how I know I'm more than one or the other, or how do I fit in both or more. And so a lot of these were born out of that way. The one in black and white over here, the gray, was graduating as an undergrad and being like, okay, now what? So a lot of these capture some of those real anxieties of like what we're going to do. And then also at that time, I was experimenting with friends creating like an online magazine where we would just create and share, write articles and create art. And some of these we also created with that intention. And then as an element of thinking that a lot of my pieces do have a story that try to convey some environmental justice elements, because again, I care about the outdoor stuff, I care about the nature stuff, and I want to be very grounded and aware in social justice. And to me, those are interconnected. So whether it's screen prints or whether it's watercolor as an example, there's a story there. The screen printing, for those of you that are familiar with Picasso's Guernica, you know that the story is about the bombing of this town, and people kind of, if you're familiar with the painting, you see some of the references that I made here to it. But here, instead of bombs dropping from the plane, it's toxic waste dumps or carried by trucks through these small Central Valley towns like Buttonwillow, where I'm saying like the bombs are these toxic elements, and how is the community trying to get the word out, as well as saying ya basta. And basta, as an example, is another of those terms. Just like si se puede has that cultural connotation in many different ways, ya basta or basta is rooted in some of these social justice movements of Latin America as a cry not just for help, but also to fight back, often to a lot of social injustices that were many times perpetuated by a central government. With the watercolor over here, it plays with like the skeletons, because people then think, oh, skeletons, Latinos, Day of the Dead, right? It's like, oh, yes, that fits. And then maybe if they know a little bit more, they're like, oh, Jose Guadalupe Posada, right? Like he a lot of what we use in any reference to like calacas and calaveras, skeletons, and even Dia de los Muertos imagery, it's often rooted in his work. But here I'm like, this piece is called Harvesting Poison because it's farm workers working out in the fields, harvesting the food that we eat, and yet being exposed to a lot of pesticides. And so I use it as an introduction to, like, if you just look at the aesthetics, you're like, oh, cool, it looks like a lot of art I might be familiar with. And then I invite you into the story to be like, it's even deeper than that. And it's an invitation to a whole body of work that's still ongoing, because you have so many field workers still fighting for their rights. let alone to not be sprayed by pesticides as they're picking the very food that we get to enjoy. A couple more slides and then I'll open up for questions. I share this because when we talk about influences, of course, I have a lot of modern and contemporary and classic influences, you know, like, yes, you can name your Frida Kahlo, you can, or rather you can name a lot of your Mexican muralists, for example, a lot of your 1960, you know, Royal Chicano Air Force, contemporary here in the Sacramento area. So that's all there. And starting in high school, of course, I was influenced by comic books. That was a starting point. And so that both was part of my development as an illustrator, as a drawer in that way. Both kind of quote unquote American comic books in many different ways, as well as Japanese comic books, a lot of manga. For, you know, those of you that are kind of semi-astute comic book readers, I know I'm looking at you, Jaron, and Monica, is you can see little things about how Mike Mignola as a comic book artist was something I was really into, a lot of the Neil Gaiman's Sandman series and the different artists in that style, down to the different manga artists that I'm just blanking on their names, but a lot of the Ranma 1/2 and a few others that influence a lot of these. But this, why this was important, because not just because it's things to draw, but also skills to test, right? It's like, how do you develop not just the ability to draw a line, but the confidence to create with it? And I can't speak for all the artists, but I would, you know, even to Luis, to me, there's always been that battle of like, how do you get what's in your head to actually appear on the canvas? Like, what's that fidelity? Will it get there? And I don't know. I know some people are very good at that. For me, it was just not just getting better to close that gap, but developing a confidence of saying, it will translate into something and that's okay. And I'm happy with what lands on the page. So a lot of drawings in these ways, that's how they started. And that they were still, you know, rooted in a lot of the development to values and social justice that I care about. This is a question that Luis kind of threw out my way, right? It's like, yeah, so how is your art in relation to some of the community-based and organizing work? And these are examples of that. This would be on your left, the hand. This is an example where it's like, it's one of those assignments that we won't get in art class, right? Trace your hand and then be able to create something with it. And this was me making a statement about Tibetan freedom, which is actually still a thing and an issue, but especially back in the late 90s, it was an example of a political oriented campaign that we wanted to bring more attention to. And then later on, undergraduate and above would be the Zapatista movements down in Chiapas, Mexico. And this is ways that you can see my cartoony style. You can see the influences. You can see the comic books. Well, also me trying to think about how that connected to things that I cared about. And moving on to different elements of screen printing. You know, screen printing, not just with the screen printing silks, with silk screen, but also just printing in general, in this case, like block printing. So this is an example of, right, of being able to, you take your piece of linoleum and you sketch out what it's going to be and you carve it out and you run the roll and then you do the press. It's a lot of work. And then getting it to a consistency that you want, of course, it's its own level of work, but I'm sharing these as types of examples. And for the screen printing, I included these to kind of like present a snapshot of what it looks like from moving from like conceptual idea to like the sketching of it, to inking it on the, I'm blanking out on words here, but on the transparency that then gets burned onto the screen that you then use to be able to run the colors. And of course, there's the technical work, which is making a screen print, running it, and trying not to make a bunch of mistakes. Like Luis knows this. You can easily make a lot of mistakes. There's also mistakes that you'll notice and somebody else won't notice or care. But you're like, it's work to get it the way you want it. But also here you see those, even here you see the influences of both Mexican humor, culture, as well as the 3-panel influence of a comic book, of a comic strip, right? So these are the ways that you see that. And then I believe I have here on the right, you have the finished piece and then a watercolor variation of it. So you see the Amorcito Corazón, yo tengo tentación de un beso, which is a song, right? And so you see those little comic book, or what we call sequential art, as an example. All right, get a few more. I want to close out with some of these, and then let's just jump into question, and maybe if I have other examples. So these, growing up, it's interesting because those early influences, I think, shaped the way that I wanted to think about story and narrative in a lot of the art that I create. And some of these were early accessible art to me, which was comic strips. But later on, I would realize and go back, they made it seem easy, but there was both a lot of technical skill with it, which also with a lot of imagination and ideation. And one of those early ones was Calvin and Hobbes. Calvin and Hobbes, I still have those books, and you still see the way that he does watercolors, and it's amazing, but there's a simplicity to his design. But there's also a complexity to the way he does it, and the narrative that he puts in there. I mean, even our English teacher from senior grade in high school would use words from Calvin and Hobbes strips as the vocabulary words for weekly quizzes, as an example. Kino is another one that later on also blew my mind. Argentine Spanish. And his power is in not even something including word balloons. It was just trying to convey an idea or something purely by creating the visual. But when I first encountered his book, I was like, it wasn't just like I want to draw like him. I want to create like him. I want to think in that way. Like, how do you take an idea and try to capture it in visual form? Right? And often, without needing to explain it all, you could tell more about it, but you would want someone to look at it and go, I see something here. Rios, Mexicano, he's another one. Now, he's an example that I appreciated because he was a political cartoonist. So he was sharp. I mean, that guy, you just see the same thing, simplicity of delivering a message, but kind of punch, and also the style conveyed so much to me. I think I have one or two more. Sergio Aragones, Spanish Mexicano también. He's famously a comic book artist. He created a lot for Mad Magazine, so a lot of his books, but he also created some comic books like Gru the Barbarian and whatnot. And he was someone too, fast, cartoony, but you see how much detail, how much you had to convey. And so those were early inspirations for me later as I would like create more, how I would think about approaching, story and style and form and all of that, even as my own style grew, developed, and changed. All right, I think those were the main ones I wanted to start with. I'll stop share because then that's the approach I usually take when I make, even whether it's a meme or like some little visual for voting or like vaccination or things like that. I often try to approach it with that type and style of humor and the like. So I'll pause there, Luis, and I'm guessing there's already a question there. We want to open it for others.
Cool. Thank you very much, Jose. And yes, we have a couple of questions in the chat. The first one is, is there any particular medium that you have not worked with for whatever reason that you would like to work in someday?
Yeah, it's a two-part question. I would break that up and say, is there any particular medium they have not worked with? Yes, oils, because they take a long time and to dry and to use and all of that. I used them twice and I was like, yeah, not for me. But if I would think about that, I would like to work in someday. That's a good question. I think I would revisit, some of the non-oil paints, gouache or temperas and the like. I think it's interesting because I want to say that not just the comic book, but maybe the comic strip influence really pushes me to try to think more about line art rather than color art. And I think that's been a limitation in me approaching it more as painting. So I think when we think about painting in that way, for sure.
Thank you. There is another question in the chat. What would you say to youth or students who may say, I want to be an artist someday, or who might experience some feelings of imposter syndrome or not feeling good enough?
Yeah, that's always a good question. As as a kid, so to speak, really what I mean by as a kid, especially in all the art classes, and all the art classes from middle school all the way to junior college, I reacted to the expression, you first got to learn all the rules so you can break them. Because I'm like, well, what's the point? But I understood finally what that meant later, which is understand where not a rule, but rather a design element is coming from. So you know how much you can push it. And even as much as you push it, it'll still make sense to the reader. It's easy to say, but often that's the difference between drawing poorly versus drawing very stylistically. Because drawing poorly, as an example with figure drawing poorly means you don't know how bones connect in the body or general muscle groups in. I still struggle with all of that because I don't, how to put this, I didn't train as a figure artist. And yet I knew how important that it was, so that if you push it into cartoony form, people still get a sense that it can exist as a real thing. And so anyways, I'm saying this because what would you want to say? I want to be an artist someday. I'd be like, here's a couple of things. One, artist may mean a profession. Artist may mean a way of life. Artist may mean a style. All of those may combine together, or they might be very different. And it's all possible. If you asked me in high school what I wanted to be, I said a comic book artist because I didn't know better. And what I mean by that, I didn't have all the information until later you realize comic book artists work really, really hard. And then I thought, do I want that as a job versus do I want that as an experience? Because then as an experience, is that I like to draw, I like to create. What are other ways that would allow me to do that wouldn't be a comic book artist and having to produce 30 pages in a month? And so the second thing that says you got to work for it. I made so many mistakes. I still make so many mistakes, but the practice comes in drawing and drawing and drawing. And I started by not tracing, but copying a lot of Disney cartoons or those kind of things. So I look at the picture and then I would draw it, and just to kind of be able to say, does it look like it? And that helped a lot of my eye hand coordination and fluidative line and all of that. And then lastly, it's the motivation and aspiration. A mentor would often say, al que le importa, al que le importa, le importa, which I also bristled to because I don't want to hear that. But they were right. If it matters to you, you're going to put in the time, intention, you're going to ask, and you just got to keep trying. You kind of be able to keep working through it. So I would say that. And then, I don't think I have a good answer to whether you will know when you hit your style. People would ask me, it's like, what's my style? Or how do I know, how can you tell that something was made by me? And what does that look like across different stages? I kind of think it's like, if you want to be an artist, you just got to draw it. You just got to do it. And then you got to like keep at it, because I think you'd be surprised. It's like hiking, right? You're like, well, how far is it? Well, how many miles? And all this stuff. Like, you start walking, and then you can be able to realize I've already gone 3 miles. And I did it by walking it, not by overly thinking or complaining or whining about it or looking at the map or thinking about all the topography. Like, you actually had to walk it.
Cool. Thank you, Jose. There are a couple of more questions in the chat. One is Fear says, thank you for your presentation. My question is in regards to the incorporation of the arts to the school curriculum. I would love to hear your thoughts on this topic.
That's a great question. I mean, the short answer is I wish it wouldn't even be like, it's just a given, right? We should have arts in the school curriculum, period. And for me, it's been a journey of disappointment, knowing that sometimes arts, it's either considered an extracurricular, or it's one of the first things to be defunded. It doesn't get as prioritized as other subjects, especially when it came to like science, as an example. And you saw this in school curriculum when there was such a huge, there still is, but especially in the birth of having such a huge focus on STEM. And all of a sudden that became a priority, to the point that people began to realize, well, an arts education actually can be very useful in all these different ways. And that's why you added the A. So now then it became STEAM. And then I'm thinking, well, we can keep adding letters and then go back to where we started, which would be a holistic, curriculum, or a kind of liberal arts type of college curriculum that complements a lot of the other elements. And the last point I say is, for me, especially when I was a teacher, it was, how do I find opportunities, regardless of what the subject area that I'm in, history, for example, or science, that I can include art, both as a way to approach and understand the subject, while also being a way that students could express themselves for evaluation in that subject. And so sometimes that meant that students could create a comic book as part of their final project. My English teacher from high school actually was very good at this, and I think that was an early inspiration, that I created comic books to be able to, that was my book report of the book. We could create a mural, and that was what I represented on the mural would need to show that I knew what I was talking about. It was kind of a test. And so I would do that with my students, down to visual, to performance as well, and say, well, you're gonna create a skit, but rather it's like create a theatrical representation, right, for that. So there's ways that, and often I would look for opportunities to ground that in a cultural element for the students. So for a lot of my Chicano students, it'd be like, hey, look at these codices. This is visual narrative right here, right? So think about how you are continuing a tradition of relaying information and knowledge in visual form.
Thank you. There is another question. What is the worst advice for artists that you wish would go away?
I have, that's like, I can't pretend to know what's all the advice that artists get, that we all have. I like to think we all have our different prickly points. One for me is like, well, if you want to learn how to draw, you got to learn, you first got to emulate the masters, which basically meant all of the Renaissance illustrators and painters. And I say this because that's part of the reason why, like, my art education in college stopped. It's because I had a professor who just would drill into us, you got to learn from the masters, you got to learn from the masters, you got to learn from the masters. We had to copy, we have to copy we have to reproduce some of their illustrations and paintings to the point where I didn't enjoy any of it. And I almost flunked that class. And that was such a painful experience that I switched over to history as a major from art. And I still kind of kept my art education, if you will, in different ways, but it was no longer my college track. And so that was a way that it stuck with me. So whenever I hear people, you got to learn from the master, I'm like, tell me what you mean by that, because I want to be cautious about not introducing a traumatic experience to somebody.
Yeah, thank you, Jose. Yeah, I can totally relate with that part, and there is also something that I see a lot happening in the schools. That besides that, that we are very Eurocentric in the art world. Like
Yeah,
we see the morals. Yeah, I mean they were masters, they were great, but if we look at other geographies around the world, you're gonna find masters in there too that not necessarily
exactly.
have to center in this idea they only from Europe, and that, and also a representation. I mean, in a school, I didn't got a in art school. I didn't got a Chicano professor giving me advice in school. It was more like people in the community, community members that I knew that were in a way or another involved in art education that in a way inspired me to continue doing art and not dropping out of college. And
It makes a huge deal for sure.
yes, and then my question will go in this idea that I like it. What part of your art process did you enjoy the most? I like it
Yeah.
that you showed some of the photographs showing different parts of the process, and like what part of that process is the one that you enjoy the most?
Yeah, it's a good question. So many times it's the sketching, it's the creative process, right? Because it's very joyful and very loose. So for me, I've often really appreciate that, along with the completion. With and by completion, I think we all have different takes on that, because you know, when do you decide it's done? Some people keep working on it and working on it and working on it, and for me, it's like I want an element of like it tells the story that I want it to get at. Could it technically be better? Definitely. Could there be different approaches and interpretation to the color and all this stuff? No, for sure. Will I spot things that I'm unhappy with because I'm like, that's a mistake? Yeah, but it's like I like the satisfaction of satisficity, that it's good enough. And so that's a very powerful process. Um, the one I like the least is inking, just because I feel so focused on like making sure don't mess up the line or get it right, which is the opposite of sketching. It really doesn't matter. Like you'll get opportunity. So I often look at it as like the difference between playing with clay versus chipping out marble stone.
Uh, Thank you, Jose. There are no more questions in the chat, but I think Nancy, do you want to ask a question? Do you want to mute yourself?
Yes. Can you speak more about the aspect of the money and not just being a professor, like there's a lot of artists that they're there, but sometimes they don't get paid. So I don't know if you can provide any advice regarding about grants or other ways or advices, because sometimes they want us, we have to survive. In order to us to survive, we need, I don't want to be rich, with my art, but at least there are some people that don't really want to talk about that aspect when it's coming to an artist and money.
Yeah, and that's a good question, because I didn't make my livelihood out of art. I can, I've sold pieces, I've monetized it in different ways for sure, but that I say that the reason I say that, it's because I guess I'm fortunate we're not having the pressures that I know other artists have had to face. But I faced them early on when I had all these questions too. It's like, how much should I charge for this thing? And then the question, is it original? Is it reproduction? What kind of reproduction it is? If it's an original, are you accounting for all of the ways that that's it? If you want to make copies of it, there's no more. And so I, would ask questions from colleagues and say, all right, well, let me start from a different points. The first is, how many hours did it take? What was the material cost? What do you lose out if you wanted to make a reproduction of it? So that you would make sure you at least start valuing it something that wasn't going to put you in the hole. And it's also this thing that sometimes you didn't intend to create to monetize it, and yet you're faced with that question. And so I think I forgot who shared this, but they would often say you always it can be challenging for an artist to be a good business person, and vice versa probably. So knowing how to connect those two is really important if you know you're going to have a serious approach to selling your art. So get help for sure, and think about friends and colleagues. Think about all the labor costs that go into monetizing art in different ways. And then lastly is, there's different ways in which what monetizing your art means. Even comic book artists would often say like, oh, they look for the movie deals because they do way less work and pay a lot more. Advertising will pay a lot more for like less work in all of these different ways. And so it's slightly distilling the ways in which some of your passion work isn't going to bring a lot of money, but you still want to account for it. And some of the skills you develop from that can't be transferred for some of the other art making. So I did that with a couple of sketches for a couple of projects, logo designs, all of the staff, knowing that it was not necessarily be my portfolio. But then I've also, with screen printing, I could sell a lot of those, right, as part of the series and say, we made 10, I keep 3 for my portfolio for these different reasons, and then I'm comfortable selling the rest. But valuing yourself is part of one of those questions, not just how much are you worth, but how you begin to, of course, build a brand for yourself, and then let people be willing to pay for that. I don't know if that helps, but it's a starting point.
Yeah, thank you, Jose. And I think there is another question in the chat. Let me see. Schools are not training Chicanos to be artists, or no one for that matter. More importance is given to expressing ourselves or learning how to draw and paint. Let's say I want to show Columbus inside a fire pit, meaning I hope he goes to hell. Well, what if I cannot paint fire? Go ahead and do it anyways. To get my message out, it seems today the message is what matters the most. And we are not training anyone to do art. I know both are important, but to you, how important is it for Chicano teachers to teach how to paint, draw first over subject matter?
Oh, interesting question. Thank you for that. I mean, I agree with you that both are important, and it's not an either or. And I this goes back to my learning the rules in order to break them. So I personally do subscribe to ensuring you have enough foundational knowledge so that your message is that much more amplified. I don't want to say this to think that, I wouldn't want somebody to feel like their message isn't important enough or isn't worth sharing because their technical skill isn't good enough to say it. So it goes hand in hand for me. I do, using your fire example, that's a perfect example of fire is really hard to draw. For me, the challenge were hands. I mean, they still are. I mean, hands and feet. So I practice that a lot, just so that even if they're cartoony, they would still be somewhat recognizable. It was those little approaches, hair. I think all of those elements as examples are important, but it's how do they help carry each other forward? And I would say that if at any point it feels disjointed, then as an artist, to me, that's an invitation to stop and reflect and say, I love my message. My technical skill isn't helping it get there. I can stop and do there. Hey, my technical skill is pretty good. What am I doing? What am I using it for? Is it maybe my messaging, the way that I conceptualize idea isn't getting there? So maybe I can stop and then play with that for a bit.
Thank you, Jose. Somebody is just giving thanks for using the captioning during the presentation. It makes following along easier in the online form.
Good.
And there is another question. How can Chicanos, Latinx, indigenous artists support BIPOC artists?
Yeah, it's a good question. Buy each other stuff. No, I mean, you do it like with we can do it in the same way that we show support across different ways. How we spend our time, how we spend our money, how we spend our different types of capital, social capital, and so forth. So sometimes it's just that, you know, you buy something, you purchase something, you show up to events, ways that communicate, you know what, even if it's sometimes 5 people, it's still those 5 people. It's kind of like in music. How do you support your artists? You buy their tickets, you go to the concert, you tell people about it, and you applaud. I would have a friend, you know, when I used to do be in a grupo, and we would play the cantinas and all that stuff. You know, the lead singer, who was like my friend's dad, would be like, aplaudan, aplaudan, and he'd be like, que no saben que de aplauso vive el músico, right? It's the applause that feeds the musician, the artist. And so I think of that in the same way. And there's a whole that goes into that, but I think those are starting points to be able to say, how do you encourage, how do you share, how do you tell other of us, how do you amplify that, how do you purchase if you're able to, how do you show up? I think those are different ways.
Thank you. I think there is another question. Could you describe what getting in the zone, the artist zone, means to you?
Good question. There's, and so, you know, getting in the zone, at least I hope I'm interpreting this correct. It's, you know, it's that sense of flow. There's a lot of also research about flow. What does it mean? Like you're just in it. And that would often happen to me many times, not just in drawing, but especially screen printing. Show up to the studio, it's 8 o'clock in the morning. Then before you realize it's 4 o'clock, you haven't eaten. You hadn't paid attention to it, but then as soon as you did, you realize I'm starving. And all of a sudden you fall apart because you stepped out of the zone. But in that zone, for me, it meant that, as an example, an awareness that time had transitioned very differently than if it would otherwise. 2, I could see the creation of what I was working on. Sometimes it, you know, was all over the place, but it's like a satisfaction of when you make something with your hands, right? When you create something in that way. And then lastly, getting in the zone means to me that it's a combination that recognizes how hard some of it is, like the frustration, but that didn't get to lead or dominate. Porque a veces you're like, I can't draw the stupid nose, or like, I'm never gonna like get the hair right, or I don't know how to paint fire. This sucks. It's knowing that that didn't dominate the whole thing. There was definitely part of that, but the struggle is part of it, right? It's like it is part of the growth, and there's elements of joy. You could just look at it, it's like, wow, that looks good. I'm really happy with this. So that's a lot of getting in the zone for me as well. But it's definitely that you start at 8, all of a sudden it's 4 or 5, and then you're like, wow, I didn't stop.
Thank you, Jose. And there is one last question in the chat. What's Jose's soundtrack to making art?
That's a good question. I haven't updated a soundtrack, so that would be a good probably thing. For me, it's an arc. I really like to. I change it up all the time, and one way that I have approached it before is to try to match the intensity or the style of the song or music to the creative process. So highly active songs for the sketching, because I like that frenetic energy. The complete opposite for inking, because I don't want something to be like buzzing as I'm trying to be finesse with the lines. It's something smooth, maybe classical, different types of that way. And then it's cheesy, but having something with a crescendo at the end, right? It's like you push the finishing touch, and it's like dun dun da da.
Cool. Oh, thank you very much, Jose. And thank you everyone that joined us tonight. We're going to continue with this series of talks. The coming talk is this Thursday. Then next week we have a panel discussion. And then on March 1st and March 3rd, we have a couple of other artist talks. Check Soul Collective's social media so you can register for the different talks and the panel discussion. And in the chat, I'm going to share the link to the web gallery where you can see this virtual gallery that we created as part of this project. And also, this is especially for artists in Sacramento. Currently, the Office of Arts and Culture is trying to approve a pilot project to have a guaranteed basic income for artists in Sacramento. So they are trying to get support from different artists and the public, because we know artists have been helping a lot during this pandemic, and even before the pandemic. We have access to their artwork, either visuals, videos, photographies, music, and yet we don't compensate artists what is fair for the labor. We always have this wrong idea that because they do it for fun and enjoyment, we don't have to compensate them. But we don't say the same for a doctor, right? We go to the doctor and we pay whatever they charge. We go to the dentist, we pay, and we don't question that. But when it's about creatives, artists, in society, we still have some work to do in there to work like, hey, artwork is also art, is work. So there are many initiatives in there trying to establish like what are the prices that are fair prices to pay for the different work that artists do. One option to start looking at those is that maybe there is a manual to pay graphic design artists that you could use as reference to maybe transfer that into, okay, this is similar, the graphic designer does this, I don't know, an illustration, this is similar to the work an artist can do, and then more or less have an idea of what artists should be able to charge for different works. But that is something that we have to continue working on and establish these parameters to really pay artists what they deserve. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Jose. There are a lot of comments in the chat. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and see you next time.
Hay unos vidrios.
Night. Take care.
Bye.